Hello, ladies and gentlemen, such a pleasure for you to join me. The target audience for this lecture is as follows. It is recommended that you stop and watch if you are a British or European nationalist or a Muslim. Admittedly, two groups that usually aren't categorised together, but hey, I'm full of surprises today. It is neutral, so you can watch or not watch if you are a Brit or a European of a different political persuasion, or if you're just someone outside of Europe who's interested in the continent's affairs. So maybe you have European ancestry, you're an American or a Canadian, New Zealand, Australian, whatever. You're interested in, hey, what's going on in Europe? You've heard a lot of consternation about it. Otherwise, it is not recommended. Right? Everyone else probably going to be pretty boring for you, right? Like it's just going to be a snooze fest for you. But for those two, it's going to be great. But of course, what am I talking about? Well, this is a topic that really doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to give one anyway. I was born in the 1990s, in the twilight years of the 20th century, and a lot has changed in the world since then. And regardless of your political persuasion, I think most of us would agree not for the better, for the most part. But there's one thing that has not changed throughout my life, ever since I've been born, from being a child to my teenage years to now my young adult years. Yes, I am still a young adult, but come on, please, I am. But there's one thing that's not changed, and that is that there has been a constant consternation around mass migration into Britain, particularly of an Islamic variety. And this isn't just a consternation that's been occurring in Britain, it's been occurring all across the European continent, specifically in Western and Northern Europe, countries like France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, etc., etc. Pretty much all across the European continent, this same controversial consternation, this conversation is occurring. But you know what annoys me about this topic is that when people are discussing mass migration, particularly of Muslims, into Europe, into Britain, I find that most people, to be blunt, they have quite a simple point of view, and that is that they can focus on the what, right? So most people can say, grass is green, the sky is blue, Europe has a problem with immigration, right? They can talk about the what, but very, very few people can actually talk about the why, right? Okay, let's say Europe has a problem with immigration. Why? Right? How did we get to this point in the first place, right? How did we, you can have a million conversations about multiculturalism and its successes or its failures till the end of time, but how did we get to this situation in the first place? And very few people actually ever get to that point. And what my aim with this lecture is to not talk about the whats of mass migration, but to talk about the why. Why did mass migration happen in Britain and in Europe in the first place? And that is my aim with this lecture. My aim is to get you to understand the why. Where did Britain and where did Europe go wrong that we needed to rely on immigrants in the first place, right? And so I have to say, though, if you're expecting me to just throw one group under the bus or another group under the bus, I'm afraid you're going to be very disappointed. A lot of people, this is a very heated topic, obviously, and a lot of people view this topic through their own tribal lens, right? So a lot of people will want me to, throw Muslims under the bus and say, oh, they're the problem. Or some people want me to throw British or European patriots under the bus and say they're the problem. I'm afraid not. I'm afraid, this topic we cannot view through a tribal lens. If you want to figure out why Europe and Britain has a problem with immigration, we're going to have to zoom out of our own tribes, zoom out of our own bodies, and see this from an objective, sort of orbital perspective, in order to understand the sociology behind this. And so that is what I'm going to do. This lecture contains 4 sections. In the first section, which I call The Torch of Civilization, I'm going to be answering what even is a civilization and how do they collapse. In section 2, which I call The Dominoes of Disaster, I'm going to be answering the questions of what were the consequences of replacing Christianity with progressivism and why do men and women exist? In section 3, which I call Civilizational Natural Selection, I'll be answering how does natural selection apply collectively and how do massive demographic transitions happen over time. And lastly, in section 4, which I call the possible futures, I'll be answering the crucial questions of: will Islam become the dominant cultural force in Britain, and what is an alternative path that could be taken instead? And of course, the Blue Ocean Foundation for this lecture is collectivism over individualism. Alright, so this is going to be a long one, so let's just get right into it. This is how feminism brought Islam to Britain. And as I said, we'll start off with section 1, the torch of civilization. So I want to start off with a rather strange question, and it's a question that might sound a bit silly because everyone thinks that they know the answer, but very few people, when it is put towards them, actually do. And that is, what is a civilization? It's a word that you hear thrown around all the time. Western civilization, Islamic civilization, Chinese civilization. But what is that word? What does it mean? And of course, you could just look up a definition in the dictionary, but I'm asking you, I want your definition. What do you think it is? Well, I'll give my definition. My definition of what a civilization is a set of stories, standards, rituals, traditions, and ways of being unchangeably passed down from one generation to the next. Now, the problem with this is that just sounds like a bunch of mumbo-jumbo words on a screen. However, I think there's a way that you can describe this that I think is really potent. And that is what I call the torch of civilization. It's an old concept. Some of you old school viewers might remember this from many years ago. But the idea is, you have a torch. What is a torch? It's a light, right? So if you're in darkness and you have a torch in your hands, you can see where you're going, right? The torch is a symbolic metaphor for vision. You know where you're going. It's your guide, right? And you could say that the torch is things like Christianity or Islam. It's the bedrock, the foundations of your of what everything else, the institutions of your society are built upon, right? And it's these things that guide you. So, for example, your education system, your economy, your culture, everything is built upon this universal blanket that's not just yourself, but everyone in your society wraps themselves in. It's the things that everyone agrees on, right? And so to take, as we're talking about Britain and the Western world here, we'll take Christianity. If you grew up in Britain and you come from a Christian family, at some point when you were a child, your parents taught you about Adam and Eve, right? They taught you about the Bible. Or if your parents didn't, you picked up on it. But usually your parents taught you about it. And so your parents tell you about Adam and Eve, the Bible, God, and then you sort of and you celebrate things like Christmas. You celebrate Easter, for example, and you sort of from that, you subconsciously, that gets weaved into the rest of how our society is formed. As I said, the institutions of society are built upon that foundation. And so your parents essentially give you, as I said, the torch of civilization, a guiding light to guide you in the darkness. They don't just leave you in the darkness and go, right, you're on your own, see ya. No, they give you a value system that you can use to guide your way through the world, such as Christianity, for example. And then when you get older, when you're the adult and you have offspring of yourself, you then pass that torch to your offspring, right? But the only reason why you could do that is because your parents gave it to you. And the only reason that your parents gave it to you is because their parents gave it to them, right? Your grandparents gave it to your parents. You give it to your offspring, right? So it's this thread, right? The torch is the same torch. The torch doesn't change. Christianity doesn't change. It's not got a patch. It's not going to, hey, have you heard about the 11th commandment? Oh yeah, it just came out last week. No, like there's 10 commandments. There's been 10 commandments for centuries, right? The Bible hasn't got an update, right? It's the same thing. But it gets passed down. Right? The torch is the same. The religion's the same, but it gets passed down from one generation to the next. Because, of course, we humans, we're finite, right? I mean, we're not going to last forever. I might have a young, nice face today, right? But it's not going to, one day I might have wrinkles. I'm not going to be here forever. No generation is here forever. We have to pass down things to the next generation and to the next generation and to the next generation to keep things going. But that's what civilization is, right? Civilization is that thing, that foundation, that guiding light, that principle, those festivals, as I said, the definition that gets passed down from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, right? That's the torch of civilization. And obviously, as I said, in the Western world, for the last few centuries, Christianity has clearly been our torch of civilization, right? I mean, if you study English history, you go to 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, it's Christianity, 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 regardless of the generation, was always there in the background. And yes, of course, you had transitions like from Catholicism to Anglicanism, right, because of Henry VIII, right? You've had changes in Christianity, but it's still Christianity, right? Like that foundation has not changed, right? So when people say Western civilization, you've got to subconsciously understand that they are saying Christian civilization, because ever since the Roman Empire, ever since the days where the Romans abandoned paganism and embraced Christianity, which took a long time, by the way, we have been a Christian. That has been our bedrock. That has been our torch. That has been our guiding principle, right? But here's the thing. Theoretically, if we dropped the torch, right, we'd lose our light. And a void of darkness would be created where we'd blindly stumble until we found another light to guide us. I mean, obviously. Right? I mean, if Christianity is the light that guides us, it's the foundation of our civilization, and we drop it, right, then we're in darkness, right? We have nothing to pass down to the next generation. Like, everything's up for debate. We would need something else because we're in darkness. We need a new light, right? Question is then, can the torch of civilization even be dropped then? Because that's such a dramatic transformation. And the answer is, of course it can. Europe was once pagan, it became Christian. So we changed our torch, we changed our guiding light. And of course, today, calling Europe Christian might, have a few guffaws in the back there, right? But we'll get on to that. But can the torch of civilization be dropped? The answer is yes. One way to do it, you might think, is to simply not pass the torch. So let's say that, you're in a Christian country, but you're not a Christian, and you don't want your sons and daughters to be Christians. Well, you can just simply not teach them about Christianity. You could not teach them the Bible. We don't celebrate Christmas in this household, blah, 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 right? Maybe you'd celebrate Festivus or something like that, right? But here's the thing, that doesn't really work. And the reason it doesn't really work is because assuming that you live in a Christian country still, your sons and daughters will still be engaged on institutions built upon a Christian foundation, surrounded by other young people whose parents are Christians. And so even if you don't pass them down Christianity, they'll pick it up anyway passively through living in Christian society. So it's not really effective. But there is one way to effectively drop the torch of civilization, and that is to simply not have any offspring at all. Right? If you have no offspring, even if you were theoretically a fanatical Christian, you have no inheritance. You have no one to pass that torch to. When you wither and die, the torch drops with you, right? And assuming that everyone else didn't have offspring who was like you, then your value system would also cease to be passed down, right? And that is precisely what has happened in Britain, and that is precisely what has happened in Europe. And this brings us on to section 2, what I call the dominoes of disaster. So I'm sure we've all heard of the domino effect. For the one person who doesn't know, the domino effect is, imagine you have a row of dominoes and they're a mile long, right? That's a lot of dominoes. And assuming there was no interference, you could flick a domino right in front of you, and inevitably a domino a mile away at the end of that line would fall. Right? So the domino effect is essentially you do one little thing changes and loads of other things change as a result of that, right? That domino effect. And I think this is an absolutely fantastic motto for what we in Britain and Europe have done ever since we dispersed of Christianity. Because you've got to think of Christianity as the Christianity domino, right? And the Christianity domino was the Genesis domino that was flicked that caused all the others to fall, right? So everything that I'm about to talk about now could not have changed unless this domino collapsed. This was the first domino. By the way, calling this the Genesis domino is quite an interesting way to put it, considering the topic, right? It just goes to show how ingrained Christianity is in our vocabulary. But everything that I'm about to talk about could not have been changed if this domino had remained standing, right? So, With Christianity collapsing, everything that once had an answer now became a question. Everything once sacred was now up for debate, and everything once sinful was as well. Think about it. If Christianity was our torch of civilization, our guiding light, our guiding principle, and that collapsed, right? Then everything, with Christianity gone, there's nothing sacred anymore, because what was definitionally sacred is a Christian concept, and what was sinful is a Christian concept, right? And so everything that once was is now no longer. Everything, as I said, everything that once had an answer now becomes a question. Well, like what, you might say? Well, think about this. Even as far back as the late 1800s, right, with Nietzsche, a philosopher, a German philosopher, wrote a book called Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's a pretty fantastic book, by the way. I rated it 4 stars. It's a little bit of a complex read, let's say, because it's a fiction and it's wrote in very esoteric terms, right? I wouldn't recommend it for the average person. But the idea behind this book was essentially Nietzsche's came from a very religious Protestant family, and he was once a Christian himself. However, he lost faith in Christianity at a rather young age, and he started to almost have a sort of existential crisis in a way, and started to try to conjure his own torch, to get his own torch, right? Because he felt like he was in darkness. He needed a guiding principle to follow. And in this book, he came up with the idea of the Superman, right? And the idea was that every man has to follow his own, has to almost, this is a weird way to put it, but almost become his own god, not in a self-worshipping, hedonistic way, but find your own destiny, put your own constraints on yourself and follow them, right? You've got to sort of, you can't just follow the herd, as he puts it in his own words. You have to sort of climb your own mountain, even if that means being in solitude and being away from the masses who are the herd, right? It's much more complicated than that. There's no way I could possibly summarize this book in a slide. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because I'm trying to prove to you that even as far back as the 19th century, people in Europe were, obviously Nietzsche was an intellectual, so he's not representative of the average person, but the intellectuals were losing faith in Christianity, and that inevitably reverberated downwards to the common people. And again, this led to all sorts of consequences. Nietzsche was a little bit naive, in my opinion, to believe that the Superman concept could work, because obviously the average person, humans are communal creatures, tribal creatures. The idea of every person individualistically coming up with their own rules and mandates is wishful thinking, to put it mildly. In reality, of course, we sort of created some Christianity replacements that were collective ideologies. And of course, we all know what they are, because they essentially dictated the entire story of the next 100 years to come, the 20th century, right? Of course, they were, originally communism, right, which is perhaps the ultimate Christianity replacement, a sort of hyper-rationalistic, hyper-scientific, atheistic, new world ideology. In response to that, of course, you had fascism, right? So, which was essentially just a reaction to communism and everything about it, a sort of unusual mix of modernism and traditionalism, but certainly very collectivistic. And then, of course, you had liberalism. You'll note, by the way, that I've portrayed liberalism as being ugly graffiti, and that is because I believe that, and this is controversial, but I believe that graffiti is perhaps the ultimate symbol of liberalism, this sort of unwanted, individualistic, in-your-face diarrhea that is just perpetuated everywhere where liberalism reigns supreme, with no... I just think graffiti is just such a perfect symbol of liberalism. It's like this sort of, like, I'm just going to put this here, and what are you going to do about it? Like, like that to me summarizes liberalism, this sort of hyper-individualistic ideology. But besides the point, these were the free solutions that Europe came up with when people started to lose faith in Christianity. And, of course, different parts of Europe embraced these things differently. Of course, Eastern Europe, Russia, which became the Soviet Union, of course, was communist. Germany, Italy was fascism, and then places like the UK, for example, was more liberal. And we all know how this went, of course. Fascism was defeated in World War II, right? And then inevitably, communism was defeated in the Cold War because it didn't work, which left liberalism. And liberalism has yet to collapse to this day, to the point where neoliberals smugly smile and proclaim that liberalism is the end of history. It is the future. This is the answer to all of humanity's problems. Liberalism, yes, this is what we need, right? And what annoys me the most about liberals is they are so smug about the fall of communism and fascism, and I understand why. Communism, who the hell would want to live in a communist country? And fascism evidently doesn't work because you annoy so many people on the outside that you end up getting destroyed from the inside. From the outside, I should say. It's actually quite poetic if you think about it. Communism is always destroyed from within. Fascism is always destroyed from outside. But liberalism is, as I said, it's this remarkable thing where it has simply remained intact, right? And people, even though there is so many flaws to liberal societies, but again, the response is always the same. Oh, well, if you dislike liberalism, you must be a communist or you must be a fascist. It remains here. And we are still living under this failed experiment. Why do I call it a failed experiment? Well, in much of Europe, including Britain, the Christianity domino, now toppled, was thus replaced by the liberalism domino, as I said. But the liberalism domino, and this is how it works, when a domino is flipped, a new domino takes its place. Right, so Christianity gone, the liberal domino, and again we're talking about Britain here, and eventually the rest of Europe after World War II and after the Cold War. We now have this liberal domino, right? So what are the consequences of that? Well, under this new liberal paradigm, one of the first dominoes to fall after the Christianity domino was the gender domino, right? So this is where we're going to go into a little bit of biology, and it's going to be a bit strange. Unusual question, but why do men and women even exist? I mean, it's a pretty strange question to ask, but really, I mean, think about it. Why do men and women exist? Because in terms of survival, notice how I put terms of survival. There's always a typo, isn't there? But in terms of survival, wouldn't it make much more sense if every adult could reproduce with every other adult instead? I mean, think about it. The compatibility rate would be 100%. If every man, and I know this is a bit of a weird thing to talk about, but if every man could reproduce with another man and every woman could reproduce with another woman and men and women could obviously reproduce with each other, basically what I'm saying is if everyone could get pregnant and everyone could produce sperm, then the reproduction compatibility rate between humans would be 100%, right? Every adult could reproduce with every adult, right? And so doesn't that just strangely make sense? Like, what is the... Instead, whatever made us, whether it be God or evolution, instead said, no, sorry, only men and women could reproduce. So now the compatibility rate is half to 50%. Well, that is very strange if you think about it, right? Because surely the point of life, or seemingly the point of life, is survival. And surely human beings would be able to survive much better if every adult could reproduce with every adult, right? Rather than this seemingly bizarre, no, sorry, you can only reproduce with half the adult population. It mathematically, like that doesn't seem to make much sense. That seems like a very unusual decision. But what that means, of course it is logical, right? What that means is there must be a point to men and women, right? There must be a point to splitting humanity up into male and female, men and women, to justify that 50% drop in compatibility rate. So what is that? Well, the reason is what's called anisogamy. And this is very complicated, but the idea is that the reason why human beings can't live forever, and the reason we have a finite lifespan, is because evolution, change, requires reproduction. And genes love diversity. And so if you have a man and a woman who reproduce with each other, their offspring is completely fresh. It's almost like an encryption key. You have a completely new encryption key. If human beings were alive forever, our encryption key could be cracked, right, by diseases, by parasites, or just by the environment generally, right? We're not keeping up with our environment. But by constantly reproducing and by constantly creating these new humans, we're keeping ahead of diseases, we're keeping ahead of parasites. right? We're creating new genetic combinations, new encryption keys to keep us ahead of the curve, right? We're in a sort of, we're in a sort of race, an evolutionary race in a way, against everything else, against diseases, against everything, right? And if men could reproduce with men and women could reproduce with women, as strange as this sounds, there wouldn't be enough genetic diversity. It would be like, if men could reproduce with men and women could reproduce with women, it would produce offspring similar to inbreds, right? To incest, to brothers and sisters reproducing. I know this is a very strange thing to talk about, but that would be the conclusion. But meanwhile, if you split humanity up purposefully into two very distinct types of human beings, one that produces fast-moving sperm and one that produces sort of just eggs, and you force them, not force them, but you essentially say, if you want to reproduce, you're going to have to reproduce with each other. Well, inevitably you will have some genetic diversity, again, unless they are brother and sister, which is very disturbing to think about. But again, to put this in nerdy terms, if everyone produced identical gametes capable of fusing with any other gamete, there would be no differentiation in reproductive strategy, increasing compatibility, but reducing genetic diversity, making humanity more vulnerable to disease, parasites, and environmental change, right? So it's a very nerdy way to put it. But essentially, gender exists essentially for genetic diversity and to increase human survival, right? So even though the compatibility rate is halved, not really, because the quality of human being is actually much more increased, right? So it's about quality rather than quantity, you could say. But there is another reason, and that is that anisogamy also translates into clear role differentiation as well, right? So men and women are clearly very, very different from each other and perform different roles. Or more accurately, we specialize in different things. People in the modern world often struggle to define concretely what masculinity and femininity mean, but the definitions are actually obvious. I mean, it really is. Masculinity is whatever men are that women aren't, and femininity is whatever women are that men aren't. People in the modern era find this concept so baffling. The amount of hours-long sociology lectures about gender are such a simple topic is so amusing. But nevertheless, put it this way. Masculinity, what are men that women are not? Well, men have physical strength. So men, for example, can easily gain much more muscle. Men are much more physically strong than women. It's not exactly, not exactly a revelation, right? But that comes at the cost of birthing capabilities, right? The reason why women are physically weaker is because, of course, women have to have womb. You have to have a womb. You have to have breasts, right? And breasts exist not just to look nice, but to provide milk for their offspring. Essentially, a woman's body is a long list of compromises, often painful compromises for strength, in order to maximize birthing capabilities and looking after offspring. So men can gain the advantage of that physical strength, right? But women gain the advantage of being able to reproduce. Men have impulsive bravery, right? And so the people who run into a burning building to save people, for example, or people who fight on the front lines are often men, right? So, of course, there can be some women, but it's about 99% men to 1 woman, right? Whereas the cost of that for men is self-preservation. Women tend to have much more self-preservation abilities, right? So if in prehistoric times, when a tribe, for example, would get conquered, all the men would be killed, right? And the women would have to adapt to these new men who had conquered the men who from their tribe, and they would have to adapt accordingly. And women would do that in order to survive. And so women have much more self-preservation. I mean, you can see this in other animals. I mean, for example, if you go in between a female animal and their offspring, the female animal will become even more violent than even a male animal will, right? You can see this in humans. I mean, women usually aren't violent, but if you try to get in the way of their offspring, women do become violent, right? And so, you have impulsive bravery at the cost of self-preservation. Men, of course, are much more competitive. It's psychological fact, men much more likely to ask for promotions. Men are much more likely to care about their status in society, want to reach the top of organizations, be CEOs, be prime ministers, right? Men are much more likely to want to compete. You can even see this in things like gaming, right? Men love multiplayer games where you compete against other people. Women tend to prefer much more calm games. Like, you don't really see women doing PvP, player versus player, usually, right? I mean, you can just study esports, for example, and you'll see it's a sausage fest. But that comes at the cost of cooperation, right? Women are much more cooperative, much more likely to want to work in teams, much more likely to sort of compromise in a way for that team, less likely to ask for promotions, less likely to make a stink, right? And have much more patience as well, generally, I would say. And again, you could just say the same in reverse, right? Everything that I've just said about femininity, you could say that the cost of that is the masculine alternative. But the point being is that, overall, ultimately, you could say that men and women are equal but different, right? I always say this, men and women are two sides of the same human coin. There's a reason, and we used to understand this, by the way, there's a reason why people say when they found someone they love, they are my other half, right? The idea is that we men or we women on our own are just half of the story. It's only when we come together are we made whole, right? Can we reproduce? Can we, do we have both the strengths of men and the women, the masculine and the feminine, right? It's like on our own, we're just half the human story, but when we come together, we are full. This used to be something that was widely understood. It is not widely understood that much today, it has to be said. But nevertheless, the genius of Christianity, and the other Abrahamic religions really, is that it seamlessly incorporated these biological differences into its theology, right? So you see like religions like Christianity and Islam, and they have these billions of followers and they've been around for hundreds of years. Right, well, here's the thing. Those religions could never have grown to the scale that they have grown unless they were compatible with human nature. And not just compatible, but they actually supported human nature and inspired and motivated people in order to be better men and be better women and come together better and reproduce more, right? People see this the wrong way. Like the genius, like if you had a religion that said, men, we want you to be feminine, women, we want you to be masculine, it wouldn't work. It would never grow, right? It's because it would simply be outcompeted by the other religions that promoted a healthy masculinity, a healthy femininity, and a healthy interaction between the two sides of the human coin, right? The reason why Christianity and Islam grew so massive to billions of people is because these religions incorporated biology into its theology, made it compatible, and made people motivated and inspired to be better men and better women. That's such a mouthful, but maybe you understand what I mean by that. But here's the thing, because such biological basics had been wrapped in a Christian foil for so long, when the Christian domino fell, people assumed that such was actually an artificially imposed Christian creation in dire need of scrutiny. In other words, because that's a mouthful, people looked at gender, men and women, masculinity and femininity, a man's role in society, a woman's role in society, and rather than viewing that as biology, they viewed it as Christianity, right? So they viewed why men were men, oh, well, that's because we were under Christianity. And Christianity, the Bible says men have to do this, this, and this. The Bible says women have to do this, this, and this. And that's why men and women are the way they are, right? So when the Christian domino fell and the liberal domino took its place, people started to almost reject the very obvious and clear biological realities of gender and viewed it as environmental, right? So men and women and the way we act is not natural. No, it's environmental. It was environmentally imposed on us because of Christianity. And of course, this is a complete miscalculation, but that's what people believed, right? And so this led to the gender domino, that sort of harmony that I spoke about of men and women working together, but two sides of the same human coin, equal but different. That was replaced by the feminist domino. right? And feminism looks at the natural differences between men and women, and rather than viewing them through a collectivistic lens whereby they positively complement each other, right? So again, two sides of the same human coin, equal but different. It instead chooses to look through an individualistic lens whereby they are, as individuals, deemed unequal. And thus an injustice of sorts is occurring that must be corrected, right? So it views men versus women, not men and women. Not, oh, men do this, women do this, and we complement each other as a collective. No, it's what can I as a man not do because I'm a man that women can do, or because feminism focuses more on women, because that argument would never work with men really. It goes to women and says, what can you as a woman not do because you are a woman? What could you do if you were a man, right? And it says, well, that's wrong, right? You should be able to do everything that a man can do. It's a very individualistic point of view. And, in order to justify this, what feminism does is it revises history, claiming that since the dawn of time, through a mythical, unspoken collective known as the patriarchy, all men have been oppressors, and all women have been oppressed, right? So men, the feminist narrative is that men throughout history have essentially been dominating women, have enslaved women. Women have had no say in society. Women have simply been these robots that have said, yes, sir, absolutely, sir, yes, sir, just obeying their husbands and have done nothing. Right, that is the feminist view of history. Putting aside all of the female characters of history, Joan of Arc, for example, or all of the queens of history from all the different nations. No, apparently men have had this sort of invisible contract with each other, unspoken. It's never been put in a textual constitution of sorts. It's this unspoken telekinetic contract between all men that we must dominate women and we must keep women down for some reason. Yes, this other half of humanity that we are designed to love, physically, mentally, and spiritually. No, we must put them down for some reason. We must put them down for some reason. And this narrative of this patriarchy, that women have been sort of these mindless drones that have had no say in society for centuries, has been mass accepted. Like, oh yeah, this obviously must be true. And so therefore, feminism says the only way that women can become free is to destroy the patriarchy by matching men via imitating the masculine, as every wave of feminism has told women to do with increasing ferocity. Think about the earliest forms of feminist propaganda, and I mean actual propaganda like posters, that you would see, for example, in World War II. I'm sure we've all seen the classic woman flexing, we can do it too. Isn't it interesting how the even original feminist propaganda chooses a woman flexing, an inherently masculine thing, strength, right? That is the fascinating thing about feminism. It's the least feminine ideology ever conceived. In fact, I think I talk about that here. Yeah, here. In essence, feminism, despite its name, could be seen as the least feminine ideology ever conceived, disregarding all the virtues of femininity, viewing women as naught more than deformed men that need correction. That is exactly what it is. As I said, even in the earliest feminist propaganda posters, the women flexing, we can do it too. It's not about promoting the virtues of femininity, the strengths of women, as I described earlier, that only women can do, and that men cannot do. No, it's about saying, hey, women, you're weak. Femininity is inferior to masculinity. You bring nothing to the table. You're a slave. The only thing that, if you want to succeed in life, you have to imitate the masculine. So put on your pantsuit, get to work, and don't have offspring. Right? You've got to beat men at being men. That is what feminism tells. Despite its name, feminism, such a false advertisement. That is an ideology called feminism. You would think it would be all about celebrating femininity, right? Reproducing motherhood, the gentleness of women, the empathetic nature of women, the cooperative nature of women. That's not what it's about at all. Feminism is about telling women you are a deformed human being. You were born wrong. Men dominate you and have dominated you throughout history. The only way that you will ever be free of men is to be better than man, to be more masculine than man. You must work, you must be independent, you must do this, you must do that. There is nothing feminine about feminism whatsoever. It is a total historical revision. It is anti-feminine. It is anti-female. People often say, if you ask the average person in the Western world, who does feminism damage more? They'd say men. Total fiction. Feminism does not damage men anywhere near as much as it damages women. Feminism indoctrinates women right from their earliest years to believe that they are genetically inferior, deformed human beings, which is totally untrue, totally ridiculous. You know, the humanity without women would go extinct, as it would without men. We need each other. But that's precisely what feminism preaches. It is this sort of malfunction. It is this reaction to Christianity collapsing, this sort of false idea, this revision of history. It is, it's just so tragic. But this subconscious negative view of femininity came with numerous significant collective consequences for society, aka more dominoes falling, such as what, for example? And numerous dysfunctional replacements for such fallen dominoes. For example, the collapse of the marriage domino. Men and women used to get married, and people still do get married, but the institution of marriage has been severely depleted. I mean, if you can get a divorce, when you get married, one of the vows is till death do us part. Well, if you can get a divorce, it's not really till death do us part anymore. It's till you get sick of me and we get a no-fault divorce. Well, that's not really a marriage anymore, is it really? It's just sort of a temporary contract rather than a permanent contract. Men and women used to get married as a precursor to intercourse, right? And marriage is really an insurance policy for the next generation, for the offspring. So it was a form of stability. But with again, marriage was viewed mistakenly as a Christian creation, even though marriage is universal, and really marriage was just wrapped in a Christian wrapper. But with the collapse of Christianity, again, everything became a question. Marriage became one of those questions. Marriage became associated with Christianity. I mean, it takes place in a church usually. And so if Christianity's gone, well, we can get rid of marriage as well. What replaced it? Free love. Oh no, let's not get married anymore. Let's just have intercourse. Let's just do whatever the hell we want. Let's not take marriage. Who needs marriage? That's an old, stupid Christian idea, even though it isn't. And so what ended up happening, of course, as you can see in this chart here from the Office of National Statistics, the official British government statistical body, the amount of live births outside of marriage, particularly after the 1970s, absolutely skyrocketed. And that is because less people get married before they have offspring. And so the amount of single mothers increases inevitably. But it's not just that people reproduce before they get married. It's that people aren't getting married at all, right? You've got people who have been together for 20 years and they don't get married, and they have loads of offspring, right? But marriage just isn't a thing, and so inevitably the amount of live births outside of marriage increase. But marriage again was a way, a means of collective harmony. Marriage keeps men and women together. Obviously, sometimes that can be very dysfunctional and it's not a good thing, but most of the time, marriages work out. It forced people together in a permanent contract to say, hey, listen, regardless of what your problems are, work it out. You're together, you've got offspring, get it together. Don't start breaking up and living in different houses and then no one can afford a mortgage and then you're renting and then there's no inheritance and blah, 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 right? So that was one thing that went away. Another thing that went away is simply reproduction, right? Reproduction. When people would get married, they would reproduce, right? They would start families, usually with a lot of offspring. Well, now, of course, you have abortion and contraception more generally. Ever since the 1960s, there's been over 9 million abortions in the UK. So the UK population now is about 68 million. It would have been 77 million, right? If there was no abortion at all in the UK since the 1960s, the UK would almost have as many people as Germany. Right, think about that for a minute. But with the invention of abortion, the invention of contraception, and the mass acceptance of these things that obviously Christianity would have prevented. I mean, the Catholic Church today is still opposed to abortion and contraception, for example. Well, these things are now normal, right? They have replaced what would have been reproduction. Not always, obviously, but in the cases where they do, that's obviously the case. I mean, you can't have an abortion if you didn't get pregnant in the first place, for example. And of course, you have the collapse of the housewife domino, right? I mean, a lot of women, they would stay at home. Of course, women would have jobs, the odd jobs here and there, but they wouldn't have careers. They would stay at home, look after the family, look after the offspring, look after the house. Well, that, of course, has gone away now. Replaced with the girl boss domino, as I like to call it, where an old joke that some of you might remember from many years ago is that the problem with modern women is that they're too busy worshipping Microsoft Excel. You've got women who are in their prime fertile years, in their 20s, who could be starting families and are instead slumped up in an office somewhere in London, typing about some irrelevant nonsense on Microsoft Excel, earning 25 grand a year, paying off their student loans that they'll never pay off, right? So it's sort of like the priorities have shifted in all these different ways, and all three of these, a direct result of the feminist domino, which of course is a direct result of the Christian domino falling. All of these changes in society have a shared consequence, and that is, of course, plummeting birth rates, right? Every single one of them. This here is the population pyramid of Nigeria, right? And as you can see, it's called a population pyramid because it's a pyramid, and you can see that from let's take the males for example. 0 to 4, there is 7.3 of the Nigerian population are young males between the age of 0 to 4. Meanwhile, if you look at these, let's say 65 to 69 demographic, that is 0.6, right? So there's a lot more young people than old people in every age bracket. This is how, throughout history, with the exception of wars where a lot of people have died, obviously, but throughout history, this is normal, right? This is what a healthy country looks like. A country with healthy demographics looks like. A lot more young people to work, and a lot less old people who are retired, right? Now let's take a look at the UK's population pyramid. Yeah, I mean, it's less like a pyramid and more like a population rhombus, right? As you can see, from 0 to 4, 2.6% of the UK are males between the age of 0 to 4. If we look at 60 to 65, however, it's 2.6%. So the UK has the same amount of males who are 0 to 4 than 60 to 69. I mean, that is absolutely unbelievable if you think about it. There is just as many old people in the UK as there are young people. That is a very unhealthy demographic set because obviously old people retire, they don't work, and young people have to pick up the slack for that. Just to superimpose these two countries next to each other, I mean, look at the difference there. Focus on the not the solids, because that's what they share. Look at what they don't share. Look at the lighter colours. Look at how much more old people the UK has, and look at how much less young people the UK has. I mean, it's almost like twice as many old people and almost 3 times less young people, right? This is an absolutely massive demographic problem. And again, the reason is because a country like Nigeria, they're still Christian, right? Well, partly Christian, but even in the parts where they're Islamic, it's still the same story. They still have that torch of civilization. They're still living under this sort of men and women are working together still. In the UK, this isn't the case. We've dropped our domino. We've embraced. We've dropped our torch, the Christian torch. We've embraced and we've flicked the Christian domino, and we've put this progressivism over it. And look at the result, right? We no longer value reproduction. We no longer value the next generation. We have an aging, dying, withering population and a withering country, right? Now you would think then that given the collapse in birth rates, that the pensions domino would likewise inevitably collapse, right? Because, well, but shockingly not. Because, I mean, think about it, pensions, the money that you get when you retire. Well, who pays pensions? Well, contrary to popular belief, talking about pyramids, pensions are a pyramid scheme, right? The way that people think pensions work is that they pay into their own pension, which is true in some circumstances, but a lot of the times it isn't. People don't pay into their pensions, they pay for their parents' pensions. Right, so young adults working now, you're paying for old people's pensions. You're not paying for your own pension. Right, so it's a pyramid scheme. So you would think then, well, if there's a lot more old people and there's not a lot of young people, well, who the hell is going to pay for the pensions, right? Surely pensions would collapse. Well, as I said, no, they don't. And the reason is because mass migration was used as a solution to keep pensions going, right? Essentially, if there's not a lot of young people and there's a lot of old people, and eventually there's going to be too many old people to keep pensions going, in other words, too much of young adults' wages will be redistributed to the elderly as part of their pension package that they themselves have paid into all their lives, thinking that that's what they've been paying into. Well, that's going to collapse. And so what do? Well, what government started to do, particularly in the 21st century, as you can see there, I call it the pensions panic point, started to use mass migration to prop up the GDP figures in a very naive way. Right, so let's just import a bunch of people from the developing world, young adults, and let them pay into the systems, let them pay for the pensions. Right. The problem with this, however, which anyone with half a brain could figure out, is that this is a very bad solution because immigrants also age, right? And so when the immigrants get older, you need more immigrants to pay for the immigrants that are already here, not even withstanding the native population, right? So it's a naive and absolutely absurd solution to a problem. But nevertheless, when it is the solution that Europe and Britain went with. And so to keep the pensions domino standing, the nativism domino, and what I mean by that is essentially a country being able to survive through the fruits and labour of its own people without having to rely on immigration, well, that was gone. And so that was instead replaced by the immigration domino. In other words, to keep pensions going, but also just to keep public services going, immigrants were used. Immigrants were brought in to keep the country going. It's actually quite amazing to me when progressives often say, for example, we need immigrants to keep the National Health Service going. And I often think, do you think that supports your ideology? If anything, that just proves that there's something wrong with the native population. There's something wrong with the country if we need immigrants to stop public services from collapsing. And of course, the problem is people aren't reproducing enough because we have created a sort of anti-natalist society where we have embraced these progressive dogmas in rebellion to our Christian ancestry, right? And so, of course, but where do we get these immigrants from? Well, if you look at America, for example, it's quite obvious. They get it from South American countries, typically, or their neighbours surrounding them, right? So, of course, there's a lot of it. The Americans get a lot of immigrants from Mexico, for example. But, and I know this is very controversial in America, but, of course, the Americas is a very Christian continent, right? So the immigrants that they get are pretty much all Christian, right? Usually more Christian than the actual, the Americans themselves, come to think of it. But in Europe, however, where do we get our immigrants from? Well, if you take a look at this map of Europe, and yes, this is a map of Europe, there's nothing strange about it whatsoever. But if you take a look at this map of Europe, where do we get our immigrants from? Well, of course, we get them from North Africa and the Middle East because that is that is the place that is next to us geographically, right? And of course, North Africa and the Middle East, what are they? Are they Christian? No, they're Islamic, right? So we are having to rely on a pool, unlike the Americas, that does the exact same thing as Europe is doing, but they can rely on Christian immigrants. We can't do that. We can't. There is no large Christian countries that we can just pour immigrants from to prop up our dying countries. There is Eastern Europe, which we have done. I mean, I've often tried to explain to my Eastern European friends that the European Union actually, yes, it might provide security and stability for you to an extent. But at the same time, you do realise that there's also a demographic robbing occurring. Croatians seem to understand this, where there are young people who get qualified. They go to university, they get qualified, and then they instantly move to Germany, right? That's sort of an intra-European sort of stealing, right? Western Europe, Northern Europe loves to steal people from Eastern Europe, right? The young people from Eastern Europe. And then Eastern Europe, like the average age ends up being like 50. It's ridiculous, really. But outside of Europe, where intra-European immigration does not suffice, we get our immigrants from the closest possible places, which is, of course, North Africa and the Middle East, but they're Islamic, right? And so this led to the falling of the monocultural domino, Christianity, you could say, and the rise of the multicultural domino, and thus the myriad of tensions spoken of earlier, right? So, or implied earlier, right? So, for example, one of the things, starting in the 21st century, Europe started to get this obsession with multiculturalism, particularly the neoliberal elites. They started to preach the virtues of multiculturalism, like, oh, isn't it great how everyone can just get along? Christians and Muslims can all get along with each other. And it's like, well, yeah, but why? Like, we kind of survived for millennia, like, just with one culture, right? Why do we need multiple cultures? And then, of course, the neoliberal elites ignore these sort of multicultural clashes that often occur in working class communities, which we've seen across the UK, for example. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is, if we look at the big picture, the Christian domino fell. We replaced that with the progressive domino. Then we assumed that the relations between men and women was a Christian creation, and then we replaced it with feminism. From feminism came, free love and contraception and abortion, and then sort of women prioritizing education and the illusion of independence over, being a housewife. Being a stay-at-home mother is seen as sort of low class, is seen as sort of trashy, which is just absolutely absurd when you consider the fact that civilization relies on mothers in order to survive. The pensions domino, which should have fallen, was deemed too precious to fall, and so in order to prevent that, we imported lots of immigrants in order to prop up GDP figures, and then from that came this push of multiculturalism and this sort of idea that, isn't it great that all these different cultures can live together? But that is a sort of an excuse for the fact that we rely on immigrants to keep our public services and pensions alive, because we don't produce enough children of our own, right? So the point being here is that you can link feminism directly to multiculturalism, but very few people ever make that connection. The feminist domino is not discussed enough here. I mean, if you say, for example, progressivism supports multiculturalism, most people would say, well, obviously, Sherlock, I didn't need to watch an hour-long lecture to figure that one out. Most people know that because progressives themselves, not that they consciously understand why, but they preach multiculturalism and mass migration, etc. But I never see people blame feminism for multiculturalism or mass migration. In fact, what I actually find, and this is absolutely mind-blowing to me, is a lot of right-wingers, in a reactionary response to Islam, they sort of praise feminism. They say, like, oh, Islam hates women, and we love women, and we protect women. And and I think and they support feminism. And I think, do you know what? Are you that dim that you can't figure out that the reason why, if you really dislike Islam so much, are you that dim that you can't figure out that the reason why Islam exists in Britain and in Europe in the first place is because of feminism and these so-called values that you are promoting? In other words, the more you support feminism, the more you promote feminism, the more Muslims that you will have in your country, the more multiculturalism that you will have in your country, because you don't even understand the dominoes. You can't see the dominoes. It's too, and it absolutely blows my mind that people can't see this big picture. Like, so many so-called conservatives who make these absolutely absurd claims about Islam and call them and promote feminism. I mean, it's just absolute lunacy to me. I just think absolute lunacy. Which brings us on to section 3, civilizational natural selection. So, let's talk about natural selection in terms of individuals, and I think most people understand this, right? If you're a man and you're tall, you're strong, tall, confident, healthy, and wealthy, you're probably going to be much more attractive to women than if you're weak, short, wary, unhealthy, and unwealthy, right? I mean, that's not exactly rocket science to say, unless you are a Redditor, in which case it might be breaking news. And again, natural selection in women. Again, if you're a woman and you are young, you have thick hair, smooth skin, and a shapely figure, you're probably going to be much more attractive to men than if you're old, thin hair, wrinkles, and an unshapely figure. Again, women know this much better than men, I would say. Pretty obvious stuff, right? The idea that some individuals have traits that make them more likely to pass on their genes is typically easily understood and widely accepted. What that really means, by the way, more likely to pass on your genes, is just more likely to be attractive to the opposite gender and reproduce, right? But where people struggle, however, is comprehending this phenomenon on a collective level, where similar such patterns apply. What do I mean by that? Well, we need to imagine that there's two countries. The first country is the blue country. And the blue country has a civilization, meaning they pass the torch down from one generation to the next with stability, prioritizing such collective continuation, right? So, let's say a Christian country or an Islamic country, right? And then you have the red country, and the red country gave up on their civilization, dropping the torch, doing whatever they deem appropriate as individuals at the cost of any collective continuation, right? So kind of like a progressive country. Oh, just do what you want. You want to reproduce, go ahead. You don't want to, whatever. Everyone just believes what they want to believe. Everyone lives in their own little atomized world, right? Imagine these two countries side by side, right? Well, let's say that they were two separate countries and they were both equal in population, right? What would happen to those countries? Well, what would happen is the blue country would increase in population, right? Because they prioritize continuation, they prioritize reproduction, they respect masculinity and femininity. Right, they don't treat motherhood as if it's a trashy thing, or try and force women to be masculine and say, oh, you're a mother and you're only 22. Ew, you must be low class. No, they respect men, they respect women, and so of course the population increases because they value the family. But in the red country, the opposite will occur. The population will decrease. People will start valuing wealth over family or other things that are important, but not the most important things. People will just do what they want, right? People will feel no obligation to society, to their family. They'll just, reproduction in an individualistic society is a burden. It's like, oh, you're going to get in the way of my career. You're going to get in the way of my life. Oh, I'm going to have to invest time, like, oh, come on, like this is ridiculous, right? And so inevitably, in a nation that has a torch of civilization that values continuation and generations, the population goes up, right? In the other country that is individualistic, they go extinct. Basically, the population just goes down, right? Let's do this graph again, though, and let's say that rather than two separate countries, you have one country, right? And it's the red country, right? So it's the progressive country, right? And they start off as 100% of the population, right? But they start importing people from the blue country, the religious country, right? So what would happen is the blues would increase and the reds would decrease until it gets to a point where they are equal in population, right? It doesn't really matter if the reds were once 100% of their country. If they don't value continuation or motherhood or reproduction or respect men and women, they're going to decrease in population. And as soon as they start importing people from cultures that do value those things, they're going to increase. And so what happens as time goes by is inevitably the red country becomes the blue country, right? The country slowly gets taken over, per se. Not taken over militarily, not taken over in war, taken over passively, culturally. Simply through the hourglass, the sands of time going through the hourglass, right? And this is a process that I call civilizational natural selection, right? The idea that if you have a culture, if you have a group of people that pass down the torch of civilization, they will go up in population. If you have an individualistic group of people that just looks in the mirror all they care about is themselves, money, status, I don't want to reproduce, blah, 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 they'll go down. And when these two groups interact in the same nation, a demographic transition occurs with each generation, right? And so, again, as I said, any nation that gives up their civilization but does not replace it for another will inevitably be overtaken from within by those from other nations that still have one, due to becoming reliant on them just to survive. And again, the red country and the blue country, these have been fictional examples, but in reality, the imaginary becomes reality, right? Because the blue country, which you could say is the inheritors, that's Muslims. in this calculation. And the red country, which you could call disposables, right? People who live a disposable lifestyle, like they're just like, they have nothing to inherit, they don't reproduce, they just live for the moment and then die, and then that's it, they're like the last one. That is the native populations of Britain, of Europe at large, the once Christian population, right? This is precisely what is occurring. And if we look at some, ONS census figures on Islam in England and Wales, what you can see is in 1961, there was only 50,000 Muslims in the UK, or about 0.1% of the population. But with every decade that has passed, that 50,000 is now turned into 3.9 million, or around 6.5% of the population. What that means is that between 1961 to 2021, less than the average human lifespan, the Islamic population of Britain has increased by over 7,000%, right? 7,000%. That is civilizational natural selection, right? To go even further, however, if you look at AI projected figures for Islam in the future, based on the figures inputted, what you can see is that whereas in 2021 there was 3.9 million Muslims, or 6.5% of the population, by 2081, it is estimated there will be around 11.2 million Muslims in the UK, or around 15.6% of the population. That means between 2021 to 2081, again, less than the average human lifespan, the Islamic population of Britain is expected to almost increase by a further 3 times, right? Again, that's civilizational natural selection. Right? A lot of people, and again, this is spurred on by immigration, but it's also spurred on by the Muslims that are in the UK also just reproducing and starting families and doing it more than the native population, right? And again, let's look at the native population. If we look at the ONS census figures on the white British population, or originally the white, and then in 2001 redefined to white British, what we'll see is a constant decline. 98.8% of the population in 1961, now 74.4% in 2021. What that means is between 1961 and 2021, again, less than the average human lifespan, the white British as a percentage of Britain has decreased by almost 25%, right? And again, if we look at figures again, AI projected figures, what we'll see, and the AI has really just decreased by 6.8%, I imagine as a median estimate. Whereas in 2021, the 74.4%, by 2081, the white British population is expected to be just 33.6%, a third of the population, a minority. So again, between 2021 to 2081, again, less than the average human lifespan, the white British as a percentage of Britain is projected to decrease by a further 40%. Now again, I know that we're comparing apples to oranges here because Islam is a religion and the white British is, of course, well, an ethnicity, you could say, and a nationality. And of course, there could theoretically be a crossover between those two groups, albeit probably numerically insignificant, but nevertheless. The point of this is that Muslims are seen as a recent arrival group, right? Immigrants or the descendants thereof, right? Whereas the white British population being here typically for many, many generations, centuries back, right? What we see is that Muslims, being a healthy civilization, pass down the torch of civilization from one generation to the next. They increase in population, whereas the white British population, not passing down the torch of civilization, being individualistic, simply decrease, right? And again, ultimately, it's just basic mathematics. As I said, you pass the torch of civilization, you go up. You don't, you go down. And that is precisely the process that we are seeing in Britain and across Europe at large. There's no sort of difficulty in understanding it. It's basic mathematics. To hammer this point in, I have what I call 5 controversial truths. And people are going to hate these. Every single one of these is going to have people riling in the comments section. But they are true. The first controversial truth is this. Europe sees itself as a host, when it is in fact a parasite. You can see here a post that I saw on r/Europe, one of the largest European forums on the internet, and it says, this was by Christine Lagarde, who was one of the higher-ups in European economics. She says, Europe's economy can't grow without migrants, Lagarde warns. Not won't grow, can't grow. Europe's economy can't grow without migrants. Well, what does that mean? A lot of people on the far right in Europe like to call immigrants into Europe like things like parasites, like, oh, they just come in here and they leech off the host and they see themselves, Europe, or their country, Britain, as the host, right? And I understand that in some situations like fake asylum seekers, for example, economic migrants, that could be seen on the balance sheet as somewhat accurate. But I actually disagree with this assessment. I actually think that it's Europe that's the parasite. What do I mean by that? Well, if you zoom out and see Europe as a continent on Earth rather than the Earth, what Europe actually does is hoovers up people from developing countries. I spoke many years ago about Ghana. Ghana has an African country, very poor developing country. It has a nurse and doctor shortage. They train up their nurses and doctors. And then as soon as they're trained, countries like Britain hoover them up. And if you're a Ghanaian nurse or doctor, moving to Britain is a fantastic opportunity because you're going to get paid a lot more, right? Why would you choose to stay there unless you're really patriotic when you can move to a first world country, right? It's better for you, probably better for your family. Well, that's actually quite parasitic behaviour on the part of Britain, if you think about it. Why do we not have our own? Why do we not have a sufficient amount of our own doctors and nurses who are native to the country? Why do we feel the need, and again, need, as Lagarde says, or can't grow without such people? Why do we do that? Well, it's because we cannot survive. We cannot keep our public services alive. We cannot keep our pensions alive, as I said earlier, our pensions going, without importing people from other parts of the world, which means that we can't survive on our own merits. That is the behaviour of a parasite. You can't call immigrants parasites, generally speaking, when immigrants are the only thing, are the only people economically keeping the economy moving, right? And again, that is parasitical behaviour on the part of Europe and on the part of Britain, not on the part of the immigrants themselves, except, as I said, for those individual cases where that is the case on the balance sheet, right? That's a very difficult thing for Europeans to accept, but it is true. And by the way, I'm not saying that this situation should continue and we should, and this is why we need to bring in 10 million more immigrants. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we need to sort of understand in Europe, hey, we have a problem with reproduction. We're not making enough offspring here. We have a problem. Like if our economy has to rely on immigrants just to survive, there's something wrong with us as a people, right? We've become parasitic as a people, and that's just a fact. Controversial truth number 2. Islam is not backwards, but on the contrary, forwards. Now, what do I mean by that? A lot of people, when they critique Islam as a religion, they always say it's backwards. Oh, it's a backwards religion. It's backwards. These people are backwards. Backwards implies the past, right? Because the passage of time moves forwards. So when we call something backwards, we are saying it's like something from 100 years ago. Like it's inferior. It's something that should not be this way in this time. And people often like to mock Muslims about the way that Muslims dress, the way that Muslims live, etc., etc., and call it backwards. That is a totally meaningless term, factually speaking, because the facts are this. If Europeans cannot produce enough offspring to keep our societies going to the point where we have to import Muslims from other countries just to keep our countries going economically, then Islam is not backwards, it's forwards. Demographically speaking, in terms of time, Islam will have a bigger role to play in Britain and in Europe in the future. Therefore, Islam is not backwards, it is forwards. And so if you want to have a sort of, to be clear, I'm not saying, by the way, that, this is a good thing and that everyone in Britain should just become a Muslim then, or everyone in Europe should just become a Muslim then. No, I'm just being honest. I'm saying you cannot say that Islam and Muslims are backwards when you rely on them just to survive. And the role that this group of people will play in society going forwards seems to be increasing. How can you call it backwards? Right? No, you're backwards. You, the group of people going extinct because you can't produce enough offspring to keep your own societies going, you're backwards. You're the ones in the history books. It's these people who are forwards. It's these people who are the future. And I understand that's an uncomfortable thing to say, and people will get angry at me for saying it, but am I wrong? I'm not saying that this is a situation that should be this way, but I'm saying, am I wrong? The answer is absolutely not, I'm wrong. Absolutely not. Islam, given the current trajectory, is the future, not the past. Controversial truth number 3. Muslims in Britain have more in common with our imperial ancestors than we do. Now, what do I mean by this? We British used to believe that our culture was superior. So superior, in fact, that we proved this superiority in warfare, where we would waltz into countries, take them over and say, well, look, clearly we're better, because how the hell did we take you over if we weren't? Right? And I have to be totally honest with you. A lot of people cry about colonialism and say it's unfair, blah, 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 blah. I do not hold this view. I think that this is simply history. Like, this is how human history has always been, even in times of, like the caveman tribes. Different tribes would take over other tribes, right? Empires would take over other empires. You might say in terms of colonialism, like, oh, it was very unfair or whatever because Europe and Britain had the Industrial Revolution and the rest of the world didn't. Whatever. The point is that, different groups of people have been taking over different other groups of people throughout history. But the point is that there was a time in history where Britain and Europe at large could enact our own culture in other parts of the world. That is no longer the case. Now, other parts of the world can enact their cultures on us. And the reason for that is because the immigrants that we import actually share the same mindset as our ancestors, which is that we have a healthy civilization, we are strong, we're going to spread our civilization even in lands where they're not used to this civilization. Well, that's precisely what Muslims are doing in Europe, right? Muslims are going into Europe, which is not typically, apart from Bosnia, I suppose you could say, a Muslim continent, and are setting up shop and are saying, yeah, we're just going to carry on doing what we're doing. Yeah, we're Muslim. We're just going to carry on doing, this is our religion. We're going to have halal food. We're going to have mosques. And that's the end of the story. Well, that's quite an imperial mindset. So I don't, I know this sounds strange, but if you admire the history of our ancestors, then the Americans have a good term for this. Real recognizes real. When I see Muslims, even though I don't come from that background or that religion, I can't help but respect it. And I know that sounds strange, but it's true, because when I see Muslims, I see people who, they're family orientated, they produce a lot of offspring, they believe in God, and they stay together. They don't drink, they don't smoke, they don't do drugs. I've never seen a Muslim single mother. I've never seen them gamble. These are people that have collectivistic values, healthy values, and is the way that they dress, or the language of Arabic, for example, or other sort of religious architecture of mosques, etc., is this foreign to us in Britain? Of course it is. But again, I go back to the term real recognizes real, right? Like I can recognize a healthy, functional people when I see them. These people think like me. And what I'm sort of frustrated at is that my own people cannot inhibit the values that the Muslims have, that we used to have. Muslims in Europe, in Britain, have more in common with our ancestors than we do in terms of their values. I know that sounds a very strange thing to say, but it is absolutely the case. And if you understand what I mean by that, if that clicks in your head, and you don't just get irrationally angry and don't understand why I'm saying that, if that clicks in your head, you'll be like, yeah, I actually know what you mean. Controversial truth number 4. European population decline is not the result of an external conspiracy, but an internal failure. People always like to play a blame game, like, oh, there's a sort of anti-white conspiracy that's occurring, an anti-European conspiracy. People call it the Great Replacement, for example, where some mythical Illuminati is manipulating Europeans behind the shadows and forcing us not to reproduce. And I totally concede, yes, there are some people who are anti-white, anti-European, who do that. There's no question about that. But the idea that you can blame a small group of people on the fact that an entire continent is going extinct is absurd. No, this is the result of individual failures, individual choices by individuals that collectively come together to create a collective failure. Right, and I've put this chart here, by the way, births in the EU versus the USA, for a reason. Both the United States and the European Union have problems with birth rates. However, the European Union has it much worse. You can see here that back in 1960, the European Union had about 6.5 million births, whereas the United States just had over 4 million. You look today, 2024, the United States actually has more births than the European Union. This is despite the fact that the European Union has 100 million more people than the United States. Why does the United States have more births than the European Union? Because the United States is more Christian than the European Union, right? The United States, the red states in particular of America, the Republicans, they still pass the torch of civilization down to their offspring. In Europe, we don't do this. Now, this requires an entire lecture on its own as to why America is more religious than Europe, but the point still stands. I don't like it when people just blame an external invisible Illuminati for things that are very easily explained pragmatically. Europeans are not reproducing because Europeans ceased to be Christian, ceased to have a torch of civilization, and tried to replace our civilization of Christianity with progressivism. That's what the Americans have not done that to the extent that we have. Therefore, you have ridiculous situations like this. It really isn't rocket science. And the last controversial truth is this. The biggest obstacle to changing this situation is the unquestioned false feminist narrative. The feminist idea that it baffles me is so popular. In the 2020s, I can understand it in the 1960s maybe, but after so many decades of societal failure, this idea that there's a patriarchy, that men have this invisible telekinetic link with each other, and all throughout history women have been nothing but drones who have been oppressed by men. This idea that independence is the most important thing for a woman, even though no woman is independent, no man is independent. We all rely on the state, the police, the fire service, the healthcare system, internet service providers, electricity providers. We all rely on everyone. We all rely on men and women to survive. We're a communal. We are communal creatures. Even if you're so-called independent, you still get paid by a boss who is probably a man, by a company probably ran by a man, with investors probably ran by men, probably men. The idea that a woman could possibly be independent in any society, or men for that matter, is ludicrous. This atomized anti-natalist narrative that women, that femininity doesn't matter, femininity is a malfunction, that's something that should be ashamed, something that women need to imitate the masculine. This bundle of narratives that comes together, it is like an absolute boulder. It is fortunately going away slowly, and I've noticed this in the 2020s, particularly with young men, but the grip that it has on young women is unwavering. It is absolutely unbelievable. And that is arguably the biggest obstacle to change. Like this idea, for example, that if you get rid of feminism, you live in the Handmaid's Tale, right? This fictional world that feminists never stop talking about, where women are all forced to dress up and you know you get assigned a man and all this stuff. It's like bloody hell, you know. This is just nonsense. Like this is just like, why do you hate what you are? You know, what is this narrative that people are believing? Until, and it's not just progressives, by the way, as I said, it's conservatives who believe this crap. Until people realise that feminism is the reason why mass migration happened, why multiculturalism is pushed, why Islam has a presence in Britain and Europe at large in the first place. Until this narrative, like I described it as dominoes, until the progressive domino is flicked and the feminist domino falls with it, and all the other dominoes fall, you know, just as the Christianity domino fell, until that happens, I mean, we're stuck. You know, we're just stuck in this situation. And so, you know, what I would say is the blue ocean response to mass migration in Britain, in Europe, is this. a thumbs up. Islam is a legitimate civilization that passes its torch down successfully from one generation to the next. Thus, if it is to be anything, it is to be imitated. To be clear, I'm not saying that Europeans and British people en masse should become Muslims, right? I don't think that's going to happen. But what I am saying is all these people who view, and I'm speaking specifically to right-wingers who are 18, 19, 20, 21, like maybe you're new on that scene, maybe you're not that politically well read, but you're very emotional, you're high in testosterone. You need to understand that if you view Muslims as your sort of ultimate enemy, and you're under the illusion that, oh, if only Islam didn't exist in Britain, then everything would be hunky-dory, I'm afraid that you're very naive. You need to start looking at the Muslims. I'm not saying you need to be a Muslim, but I'm saying you should look at Muslims as real recognizes real. Hey, I like these guys. I see they've got a civilization. We used to have a civilization. We need to learn from them. You don't need to become them, but you need to learn from them. You need to say, hey, whatever they're doing, we need to do, right? And a thumbs down is mass migration. Mass migration is nothing more than an immature response to critical issues amongst the white British and other European populations, and thus should be rejected, right? I mean, it's that simple. The idea that mass migration is something sustainable, in the long term or the short term, something that can go on forever, something that is the sign of a healthy society, or as many naive economists like to say, mandatory or inevitable, is so unbelievably absurd. This mindset needs to completely just no. If a nation relies on immigrants, there's something wrong with the people of that nation. Right? There's something wrong with them. Culturally, economically, they're not reproducing enough. Right? And this, unfortunately, this is almost unheard of in the 2020s. People instead just default to the nationalist view of, oh, Islam is a big problem, and it's like, please. I mean, or the progressive sort of naivety, which is, mass migration is amazing and we need it. It's like, well, have you asked why we need it? It's like, it's so rare to see this blue ocean combination of like, hey, I actually admire what the Muslims are doing. I actually like Islam as a civilization. I might not want to be a Muslim myself, but I admire, I can recognize is real. It's so rare to see people say, hey, mass migration is actually a big problem and not a good thing for the long term or the short term. Like, it's a sign of a broken society. It's so rare to see that. Which brings us on to the last section, section 4, the possible futures. Ultimately, there are just 3 possible futures. Future 1 is that nothing changes, right? Europe never ceases engaging in the fantasy thinking of progressivism, and civilizational natural selection continues to its logical conclusion, inevitably cementing Islam as the status quo dominant culture at some point in the distant future. Yeah, I mean, it's as simple as that. If nothing changes in Britain or Europe at large, the amount of Muslims will increase, the native population will decrease. Many in the native population may actually convert to Islam, as strange as this sounds, because Islam is a real civilization, is a real religion, is a torch of civilization that can be passed down, and contrary to popular belief, Islam is not anti-white, it is a universalist religion. Many people are often surprised to hear that there's more Muslims outside of the Arabian Peninsula than in it, right? People are often surprised to hear that. But this is just to put it bluntly, this is true. If nothing changes, Islam will inevitably gain a larger foothold in society, and society will inevitably become more Islamic. This isn't, people might say, oh, this is scaremongering or whatever. It's not scaremongering. I mean, if Britain wants to be Islamic, very well. You'll see me in the mosque if that's what you really want. But that is the inevitable conclusion if nothing changes, right? Future 2 is what I call generational sectarian ulsterization, which is that's a way to put it, which is this: Europe ceases engaging in the fantasy thinking of progressivism, but does so too late in the cycle of civilizational natural selection, causing an unstable sectarian society where the contrasting large tribes within engage in a generational conflict that only seems to get more furious as time goes by. Okay, what does that mean? Well, there's an argument to be made that we might already be here in Britain now. The idea is that okay, let's say that people go back to Christianity, or people go to what I think the right solution is, which is benevolent authoritarianism. People value natalism again, and immigrants may no longer be necessary. We might no longer need an import of immigrants to keep public services and pensions going. But the immigrants already here remain. Well, then you have two groups of people who are hostile to each other, potentially. I mean, they could get along with each other, but that's unfortunately, there's no evidence to suggest that's the case. But the two groups of people who are constantly increasing in population, who don't like each other, well, then you have a sort of sectarian society where people are separated even more so than they are now, and both want the other out, right? And that would be an absolutely hellish society to live in. That would be a society of, I mean, let's just say it would not be pleasant to live in. But the third future is what I call benevolent authoritarianism, and that's this. Europe quickly ceases engaging in the fantasy thinking of progressivism, thus stopping civilizational natural selection, with a replacement civilization, aka a type of benevolent authoritarianism, with a government that strong-arms necessary collective changes while actively co-opting the ancient religions into its matrix. What does that mean? There is no possible way that I could explain what this slide means in just a few sentences or in just a few seconds. But what I would say is it essentially means that Europeans would embrace a pro-natalist culture with a strong-arm government that supports people's creating families and supports collectivism in a pragmatic fashion, that allows people to be religious, whether that be Christian or Muslim, but it incorporates these religions into its matrix, into it as secondary, as in Christianity or Islam does not reign supreme, it cannot reign supreme, but it respects them and incorporates their lifestyles into it. Not necessarily in a multicultural fashion, however, but in a sort of annexing way. Now that's really difficult to explain in just a few sentences, but the point being is that people who did not want to assimilate into the system per se, if they were immigrants, would simply be deported. And if they were natives, would simply be allowed to be disposable, in the sense that you can live your hedonistic lifestyles, but you're not being promoted, right? Like you can sort of do your own thing, but you're separate from the society at large. And those who and the government has a duty to ensure that the society continues forwards in a healthy, pragmatic, and collectivistic manner. I understand some people might say, "Oh, this sounds really scary, like 1984 or like a dictatorship or something like that." That is not what it means. Benevolent authoritarianism is not like, I don't know, like like some militarized society. It's something much more akin to modern day Singapore, right? And so what you can see is that the immigrants who wish to assimilate into that system would assimilate. Hence why, as you can see with the red line there, it increases. But at the same time, the native population would nevertheless remain a majority. That is like the best possible outcome for this. Like, the immigrants who want to remain and assimilate can do so. The immigrants who don't get deported to countries that are more fitting to their religion or culture or whatever, or language or whatever. And the native progressives essentially get segregated and can live their hedonistic lifestyles in isolation. Like, that is the best possible future. And it is that third future that is my preference. A question that some people might have is, well, why can we not just go back to Christianity? And yeah, that is like the default answer that a lot of people have, particularly, like, as I said, like 18, 19, 20-year-olds often have that, like, why can we not just return? Why can we not just return to go back to what we have before? And the answer is very simple, because sadly Christianity in Europe has become a zombie religion. What is a zombie? It's both alive and dead, right? It's a paradox in a way. Well, that is the state of Christianity in Europe. It's alive and dead. It's alive in the sense that if, on a census, many people will respond that they are Christian. Many people wear Christian crosses, right? And they sort of celebrate what were once Christian festivals like Christmas and Easter, for example. But Christianity's dead in the sense that people don't go to church, they don't read the Bible, they don't really know much about Christian theology. Many people don't. Many people, when they celebrate Christian events like Christmas and Easter, they don't really think about the religious origins. They just think like Santa Claus has replaced Jesus Christ, for example. Chocolate eggs have replaced Jesus coming back. People don't really know much about Christianity. Christianity in Europe is I view it as sort of like a reactionary religion for the most part. It's not. People don't treat it as a religion. They treat it as a sort of fashion statement. Yes, there are some people in Europe who are legitimately Christian. Yeah, some people really do go to church. Some people are priests, for example. But increasingly, the most Christian people in Europe are actually immigrants themselves, usually from African countries. A lot of people on the right wing who call themselves Christian are usually just doing so as a sort of sledgehammer against Islam. These so-called Christians, fake Christians, spend more time talking about Islam than they do Christianity. You can always point these people out, by the way, by one simple question. Ask them, who was Adam and Eve's third son? Because everyone knows Adam and Eve, everyone knows Cain and Abel. Very few people know Seth. And that is not an esoteric question. That's not a complex Christian question. That's not like saying, what is Numbers 10:11? I don't know, man. Who knows? No, that's a very, that's like, if you don't even know who the third son of the so-called first human being, first man and first woman are, you're probably not that dedicated a Christian. Actually, one of the things that annoys me is how fake a lot of Christianity is in Europe and in Britain these days. It's just viewed as like a sort of sledgehammer against Islam. No, you can't go back to when Christianity has been devolved that much into sort of a political prop. You can't go back to it, really. I mean, again, as I mentioned earlier with Nietzsche, people stopped really believing in Christianity in Europe in the 19th century, in the intellectuals. The idea that if Christianity failed in the 19th century, the idea that it's going to succeed in the 21st century under the conditions that we're in now is absolute lunacy. I think too many European nationalists have spent too much time talking to American nationalists and haven't quite realised that we play by different rules in Europe. We're in a different game. We're playing a different game than the Americans are. So I don't know. I know many people will get annoyed at me saying that, but it is true. Britain will never be a Christian country again. Europe will never be a Christian continent again. That much I can almost guarantee. The Americans are playing a different game than us. We are not playing that game. We do not have the choice to play that game. We need something more secular, but not secular in an atheistic sense. Secular in a way that we can have the values of Christianity and people can be Christians without the theological baggage attached to that. And overall, I would say this is the bottom line. What is needed, not just in Britain, but Europe at large, is an education on the realities of life. Progressivism is not a civilization, but we also can't just go back to Christianity. So we're a rejection of the mainstream ideology of the left and a rejection of the mainstream ideology of the right. But unless we grasp something unflinching and unchanging to light the torch for the future generations to come, we will inevitably find ourselves at the mercy of those who do, such as, for example, immigrants like Muslims who have a healthy, proper civilization that are manifesting that within our nations. In other words, we need benevolent authoritarianism. We need Singapore, but better, right? We need the values of Christianity, the values of Islam without the theological baggage, right? And we need that imbibed with a strong, pragmatic, intelligent, collectivistic, faithful government that knows what it's doing in a way. And unfortunately, and I am saddened to say this, we are so far away from this in Europe at the moment. We're so far away from this in Britain at the moment. We are playing a game of stupidity because the right wing in Europe has been captured by populism, which is mostly anti-Islam, without understanding why, other than the fact that they are foreigners and dress different to us. They don't really understand they don't understand the virtues of Islam, the sort of the way that Islam is a civilization, that Muslims as people are actually quite impressive in many ways. They completely reject that. They get emotional when you say that. They get angry when you say that. But then the left has been co-opted by... It's still under progressivism. It still believes in this fantasy thinking of feminism, of multiculturalism, and doesn't understand basic demographics. So we're just stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? We're stuck between two groups of morons, in essence. But I do have faith in the future, in my generation and the future generations, that as we go through this, we've gone through a progressive period of failure in the 2010s. The 2020s seems to be a populist period of failure. As we go through these periods of failure, I do think that people will come to intelligent conclusions at the other end, likely when the boomer generation is long gone, probably when I'm an old man maybe, or approaching middle age. I do think that in the end, rationality will prevail, the truth will prevail, and I have faith. I do have faith in the future that we will come to this conclusion, and in the end, it will be good for everyone. It will be good for the native populations. Will not have to worry about, mass migration and feeling marginalised in their own country. Immigrants, good immigrants who want to be a part of this country, and will be allowed to do so, and the people will actually like that. Whereas immigrants who want to create who want to transform the country into something else will only succeed if allowed to do so. And if they are allowed to do so, then that's just natural selection, I'm afraid. Very, very heavy stuff, very complicated stuff. But I hope you understand what I mean by this, and I hope you understand, you can't just blame you can't just blame Muslims. You can't just blame, these simplistic narratives that people like to follow. I'm sorry, but it just doesn't work. Zoom out, see the bigger picture, and you'll see things for how they really are. So, controversial perhaps, but nevertheless, it's all true, and I'll stand by it. We've learned a lot here. That is the lecture, and we've gone through civilizational survival, progressive failure, anisagami, individualism versus natural selection, the surge of Islam, demographic collapse, Christianity as a zombie religion, and of course we've just touched, that needs many lectures on its own, on benevolent authoritarianism. But I hope now, throughout all this, that you understand why Europe has mass migration, why Britain has mass migration, and how to stop, and the only way to stop it is by, as I said, benevolent authoritarianism, pro-natalism. Stop despising women. Be pro-feminine, but also pro-masculine, right? So please, I'm interested. Comment below. What are your thoughts on the situation Britain and Europe faces? I look forward to reading your no doubt intelligent comments, as my viewers always do leave intelligent comments, I have to say. Sorry about this light strobing, by the way. I've just noticed it. Looks like I need to change a bulb. I hope that's not been too distracting for you. But yeah, with that said, bit of a long one as ever, but an important topic. Hopefully what I've said makes sense. And yeah, it's been a pleasure as ever. Curious what you have to say. Hopefully you understand where I'm coming from and don't make ridiculous miscalculations, as what a lot of people often do, trying to explain this blue ocean sort of view to people, which is so ahead of its time, unfortunately. It's almost impossible. So if you explain it to right-wingers, they'll say that you're some sort of secret Muslim, who's infiltrator or something like that. Or a progressive. If you say it to progressives, they'll say that you're just, I don't know, just a bigot or something like that, or a Nazi or something, I don't know. Either way, I hope you can see through that nonsense. Nevertheless, folks, as ever, it's been a pleasure, and I'll see you next time.